What's going on, Living Proof Student Ministries? We are coming from the Youth Room 1.0. This is our old youth room. This is one we were in a few years ago. So we thought we'd bring you back up here to bring back some old memories, but just excited to change up the scenery just a little bit. So to get started with you guys, I want you guys to think about something. I want you to think about your most fun friend, your most hilarious friend, the friend that you think is the most fun to be around. Listen, it doesn't have to be somebody that you hang out with right now. It could be somebody a long time ago. It could be somebody when you were a lot younger that you hung out with. But I just want you to picture that person in your head. And if they're as funny as mine is, hopefully they bring a few chuckles and they make you laugh. And I just hope that you got it. I'm going to give you a couple seconds. All right, good. Mine is a guy named Duncan. All right, now let me tell you a little bit about Duncan, because Duncan was an awesome guy. When I always think about my friend Duncan, I always think about the good times that we had. I met this dude when we were in college, and that was a long, long time ago, but we're gonna look past that part. And he was a part of my small friend group, and I reiterate the word small. He was part of my small friend group at CU. He was always cracking jokes. He was always doing really funny stuff. He was playing pranks. He was always making everybody laugh around him. And a lot of times they were laughing so hard that they were gasping for air. He was just goofy, right? And maybe that's why me and him got along so well, because he was just such a goofy guy and I was such a goofy guy, and we just hit off. And the one thing I noticed about him is that he never made fun of anyone else. Now, maybe that was because when he was younger in grade school, he got made fun of all the time, and he never wanted to be on the other side of that, making fun of other people. But he just made sure that everybody that he was around was having a great time. And I really love that about him. I love that he wanted everybody around him to just have a great time. You know, sometimes I would give him rides back and forth to Louisville. And guys, there was an absolutely 0% chance that those rides back and forth would be boring. Duncan would always make sure that those rides back and forth to Louisville were absolutely hilarious. Sometimes I'd have to pull over on the side of the road just so I could clear the tears from my eyes from laughing so hard. He was just a funny guy. And people loved being around Duncan. They loved being around Duncan because he was unique, he was funny, and he cared about people. He truly cared about people. And what's crazy is that Duncan had zero idea that he had this type of effect on other people. He was just being his normal, ridiculous, goofy self. And I'm guessing you probably have a friend like that. You have a friend that has a huge, massive effect on other people around them, whether they know it or not. And maybe it's somebody you know that is so fun to be around that everybody else just wants to hang around them. Or they're so nice that they literally make you want to be a nicer person. Or maybe it's somebody that works so stinking hard that their teammates want to work harder because of them. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's somebody you know that is just so mean that they make everybody else feel on edge around them. Or maybe it's somebody that's so ticked off that they kind of bring down the mood of everybody else. Or maybe it's that person that's so loud that when you enter a room, you have to talk over top of them because they want to be the center of attention to everything. And whether it's a good thing or maybe it's a not so good effect, here's what's true about nearly everybody who has a significant effect or influence on the people around them. They don't really think about this. And they don't either realize that they have effect, or they really haven't put it into thought about how they could actually use that influence. And this is what makes this series so interesting. So tricky, the you effect. For the next few weeks, this is what we're talking about. How you affect people around you. In other words, we're talking about influence. For some of you, your influence is absolutely obvious. You know you have it. You know you probably had it for a long time, and you know how to use it. But for some of you, your influence maybe isn't so obvious. Maybe you say, I don't have impact. I don't have influence. In fact, I don't influence anybody. The me effect is at an absolute zero. In fact, the only person I have any influence over is probably my family's dog, and even that animal ignores me every once in a while. I'm not like your friend Duncan. People don't go anywhere. They don't do anything because of me. I'm not an influencer like that at all, and I don't really want to be. Maybe that's you. In either way, that's totally normal. Either way, the truth is, no matter what you think or whatever I think about influence, guys, it's possible. In fact, scratch that, it's probable that we don't realize how much the you effect, or for my case, how much the me effect there really is, or what could happen because of this. What could happen because of your influence? And guys, today we're going to look at someone who used what they had to affect others. They used what they had to affect others, even though they didn't really have much. And maybe that's you. Maybe you feel like you don't have much, so you can't affect much. But this story is recorded in one of the Gospels, which are, I hope you know this, it's one of the first 4 books in the New Testament. And I hope you know this, the New Testament is the second half of the Bible. And I hope you know this, the Bible is this book that contains a lot of truth. So I hope you guys are reading all this. But we're going to be studying a story written and recorded by a guy named John, who is actually one of the closest people to Jesus. In fact, when Jesus was actually hanging on the cross, he was dying on the cross, he looked at John and he said, John, take care of my mother when I die. I don't know about you, but to trust somebody with that type of job, you have to trust him so much. And he did with John. He trusted him so much. So we can read these words and we can know that they were written by an eyewitness who was trusted by Jesus. Now, we're going to set the scene real quick. Jesus traveled around all these different places in his 3 years of ministry. And crowds, they almost always followed him. Almost always. And it could have been because they heard about Jesus, they wanted healing for something, or maybe some of them were just curious. They wanted to see if this Jesus guy was real. Was he true? But whatever the reason, Jesus had a ton of influence, and people were always around him because of that influence. And this particular day was no different. And we're going to be in John chapter 6, starting in the first verse. It says this, it says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So imagine this for a second. A large crowd has gathered to see this amazing miracle worker, this guy named Jesus that they all desired to see. And what does Jesus do? He asked one of his disciples, Philip. He says, Philip, what would you do? What would you do? If I were Philip, I would look at Jesus and I'd say, bro, Dude, you're the miracle worker, right? This is your field of study. This is things that you do, not me. I'm not the expert here, you are. But instead, Philip doesn't respond that way. Instead, he responds more like this in verse 7. Philip answered him, "It would take more than a half of a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to even have a bite." So in other words, he says, you gotta be kidding me, right? There's gotta be so much food here to be able to feed these people. There's not enough food here. In fact, I don't even see any food. How do we feed these people? If we were gonna feed everybody here, we need a lot of cash. You know, we might be, all these disciples might be from different occupations, but they weren't all rich. In fact, they all left their jobs to go and travel and be disciples with Jesus, which is a good point. I mean, think about it like this. Could you imagine sending one of your friends to McDonald's to order 5,000 Big Macs? It'd be like pulling up to the drive-thru. Yes, this is McDonald's. How may I help you? Yeah, I'd like to order 5,000 Big Macs. Excuse me? Yeah, 5,000 Big Macs. Can you come back in about 3 days and we'll have that ready for you? It's not going to happen. Like, they're not going to make those Big Macs in that amount of time for your friend. And so the story continues. John chapter 6. John chapter 6, and this is going to be verses 8 through 9. It says, another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon, Peter's brother, spoke up. He says, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" So apparently only one mom in the entire village packed a lunch for a boy that day, okay? And Andrew thought that this was worth pointing out. Jesus, here's a boy with a sack lunch. I want to point that out to you, all right? And this is where Jesus goes to work. And this is what's so cool, all right? So this is going to be in verses 10 now. It says, Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. And guys, it's noted here that there were just 5,000 men. But what doesn't account for were all the women and children. And theologians argued that there could have been as many as 15,000 people during this time. I want you to think about that for a second. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they want. Think about that for a second. As much food as they could possibly eat, they had. He did the same with the fish. When they had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who have eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is a prophet who has come into the world." Now, there's all type of questions that pop up whenever I read this passage. Number 1, was this buffet style? Number 2, were these baskets, were they hand woven? Did they go to the market? Did they purchase them? Did everybody bring a basket? Number 3, how the heck did Jesus turn 5 loaves and 2 fish into enough food for 15,000 people? How did he do that? But guys, here's the biggest question of them all. Who had the biggest impact out of this whole passage? Think about that for a second. Who had the biggest impact out of this whole passage? I mean, it's easy to see that Jesus had the largest impact. He still has the largest impact. Even to this day, he has impact on our lives. But guys, he had so much impact back then. You think about all the miracles that he did. And every single time he did a sign and a wonder, people would flock to him and believe in him. Surely he must be the Son of God. I mean, by the end of this account, a large crowd was calling him a prophet because of the miracle they had performed. And then there's the disciples. These disciples are impactful just by hanging around Jesus. These disciples could be put to death just by hanging around Jesus. So yeah, they had influence. They had swagger just by hanging around with Jesus. But the real superstar of this entire story, we're not talking about Jesus here. We're not talking about the disciples here. I want you to focus on the boy with the lunch. The boy with the lunch. Now, at first, this seems like the opposite. How could a kid with some fish be influential? And the truth is, it wasn't the amount of what he had that allowed him to make a difference. It was his willingness to use what he had that made him influential. And this would have been even a bigger deal in the context when Jesus was living in that time. Children back then, women back then, they weren't really valued at all. No one would have seen this boy as having influence. In fact, he was on the bottom of the totem pole. But you know what? That didn't stop him from stepping up. And it was his willingness to do that. And it ended up impacting thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Can you imagine how the conversations went with his mom when he got home from lunch that afternoon? There were thousands of people there that afternoon, and they picked my lunch. They picked my lunch. Not one, not even his mom could imagine that this story would be a part of his story. That would be talked about thousands and thousands of years later. It didn't matter that this kid never took the stage. That he wasn't well known. That he wasn't in a position of leadership. That he wasn't a speaker. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't super athletic. He wasn't super popular. He wasn't cool. He wasn't interesting enough that the writer would even mention this kid by name. And you know what? Jesus wasn't looking for any of that. The only thing that mattered was that the boy brought all that he had. And you know what? It was enough. Because ultimately, this was about the power of Jesus and what Jesus was capable of doing through someone who was willing to be used and to offer what they had. Because when it comes to you affecting the world around you, it's all about you being willing to show up and offer what you have. But before that's possible, you have to realize this first. You have more of an effect than you think. You have more than an effect than you think. Imagine if the little boy listening to Jesus teach believed that he could have absolutely no effect on the situation. He's sitting there with his lunch and he's thinking, this is all I have. This is nowhere near enough to do anything. And he kept it to himself. He hid it from the disciples so that they didn't see his food. What if he hid his impact? There'd be no story to tell. There'd be no story here. In the same way, when we feel like we have absolutely nothing to bring to the table, we feel like zeros, that we don't have the potential to affect anything. Guys, there are so many stories and opportunities that we might be missing out on as a result. The way we see influence needs to change. And it's time we begin to realizing that having influence and impact is really all about bringing what you have and be willing to do something with what you have. No matter how big, no matter how small it is what you have. In other words, having an impact isn't about doing more. It's not about having more. It's not about knowing more people. It's about offering what you already have to those around you. It's about choosing to believe even when it seems unbelievable. That you may even have an effect on your friends. That you could even have an effect on your family. You could have an effect on your teammates. It seems unbelievable that you could have an effect on your siblings or that you could have an effect on your classmates. If that seems unbelievable, then just imagine what God could do with the you effect in the world around you. Because doesn't it seem unbelievable that God could take those 5 loaves of bread and those 2 fish and feed 5,000 men? Feed 5,000 men. Even if that feels impossible, or it seems like you don't have a ton of effect, I want you just to allow your mind to consider the possibility of what Jesus did with that little boy's lunch. Guys, that's something that he can do with your influence. I want you to ponder on that, because as you do, here's a couple steps I want you to consider. Number 1, you need to identify the who. And I know we've talked about the who a lot, but think about this. Who are the immediate people in front of you? Who are the immediate people in front of you that you have the potential to influence? Who are the people closest to you? Maybe it's your siblings. Maybe it's your friends. Maybe it's a classmate, a teammate. Maybe it's other people in your family. Identify the who. Second, identify the need. After you identify who those people are, identify what those people around you need. Is it encouragement? Is it time? Is it someone to listen to? Is it someone to help them do their homework? Number 3, identify what you can do to help, and then simply do it. Take action with what you know what to do. Now flip that. Before we head out and you guys get connected to virtual small groups through Zoom, I want you to think about one person in your life who has affected you with their influence. Who has affected you in your life in a positive way? What was it about them that allowed them to have any type of impact on you? How did their influence impact you for the good? And that's why we have small groups. Because the people you're around have an effect on you, and you have an effect on the people around them. And a lot of times, it's a lot more than what you think. So the question to ask yourself isn't, do I have the ability to impact others? Instead, the question should be, how will I use my influence that I already have? Because ultimately, God is the one who has the power to change people. And all you have to do is show up. All you have to do is offer what you have and let God do the rest. Guys, each and every single one of you have influence. Each and every single one of you have impact. Each and every single one of you have an effect on other people. How will you use that? Let's pray. God, you are holy. God, you are so mighty. And God, we witness today, God, just how powerful you are. God, we don't have to bring everything to the table. We just have to bring you what we have. And that's enough for you. God, whether it's the woman who just brought her 1 coin, or it's the boy who brought his 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, or if it's the woman who spent all she had on the perfume to bathe Jesus' feet. God, they all brought what they have. And God, I know that's all you ask us to do. And God, I pray for all the students out there that are really struggling with this. All the students out there that believe that they have no influence. I pray for strength and I pray for courage for them to realize that they all have influence, God. To realize the situation and opportunities that you have placed in front of them. I pray that you give them courage to take those opportunities and open doors. God, I pray for the ones that do already realize the influence that they have, whether they're in a leadership position, whether they're in a speaking position, whether they're one of the lead friends in their friend group, God. God, I know these people know who they are, God, I pray that they realize the influence that they have around the people around them. God, that they use their influence for the good, that they use their influence to bring people closer to you. God, be with us this week as we draw closer to you. Thank you for constantly working through us. In Jesus' name, amen. Small group leaders be getting a hold of you guys via Zoom here in a little bit, and we will see you guys next week.